Hi, my name is Bill Henderson. Once upon a time, there was a kid named Stan Levey. Now, Stan is in this picture behind me. That's the drummer, and this picture was taken about 60 years ago, and he is playing with Charlie Parker, Miles Davis, and Dexter Gordon. This kid said, "I'm going to be a drummer." Now, he knew at a very early age that he was going to become a drummer because he drummed on everything: the dining room table, the refrigerator, the floor, anything that produced a percussive sound. He got to be so good, this kid from Philly. His first jobs as a drummer was with guys like Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, and Dizzy used to call Stan the original because he was the first drummer that John Burks Gillespie liked. Stan has performed with the greatest singers, big bands, and jazz stars of all time. People such as Billie Holiday, Ella Fitzgerald, Peggy Lee, Miles Davis, Coleman Hawkins, Benny Goodman, Quincy Jones, and Dexter Gordon, just to name a few. He was the driving force with the Stan Kenton Orchestra, the Lighthouse All-Stars, and had a major impact on the West Coast jazz scene. Stan has also had a long career as a photographer, capturing the images of many of these famous artists for record albums and for CD covers and for his own collection, many of which you will see in this documentary. Join Stan in this journey back through his life and experience his music, photographs, and memories as he relates untold stories about his career as a jazz percussionist, studio musician, and heavyweight boxer, and professional photographer. Enjoy the trip.
I think the most important thing that one must look at here is that the beginning of bebop. Many people said it, was birthed in New York City or the East Coast. And you got to look at the 1940s from a music perspective, looking at the music, African American music, a creation called bebop. And there was Stan Levey, who at the time was probably listening to and recording with some of the giants of the early innovation called bebop, with Miles, with Charlie Parker, and above all, with Dizzy Gillespie. When you look at some of the other drummers in the community at that time, guys like Roy Haynes, Max Roach, and Art Blakey, these people were major players in the movement. But you've also got to look at Stan Levey. Stan Levey made a major impact in terms of this music in New York City. When you look at Stan's background, it wasn't to be. So Stan had something unique going on in terms of his own concept of bebop, African American music, and the love of this music.
When I was just a kid, about 6 or 7, I always played with spoons and knives, and I had a rhythm, things, I just had to get that out. And I would listen to the radio and beat the spoons and beat the knife and the fork and drive my parents crazy. So one day they decided to get me a little tiny drum set. It was not professional, a very little tiny thing. Snare drum, a bass drum, and a cymbal. And I would put the bass drum up against the radio in the living room and play along with the band. What I played along was with Ozzie Nelson and it was called the Clico Club Eskimos. That was, that was the name of the band, with Harriet Hilliard, his wife, and they went on to have a TV show for a long time. And that was something to play along too, and that's, I think that inherently got me into the feel of the music, playing with someone. And I did that for a long time. My first experience with a real professional drummer was at a time when I was 12 years old. My father knew I loved the drums and the music and everything. He took me to the Earl Theater in Philadelphia to see Chick Webb, who was a big-time band leader at that time. So I went in, the curtains opened in this gigantic theater, and I'm looking and looking for the drummer. All I saw was this huge bass drum and cymbals. And then I looked closer, and there was his head sitting right behind the bass drum, and the cymbals hanging over, and these arms flailing and playing the greatest drums I ever heard in my life up to that point. And what I didn't know was Chick was a hunchback. He was about 4'11", 4'10". And he played the most fantastic musical drums. First time I'd ever heard that. And the singer of the band was Ella Fitzgerald, who at that time was 15. And lo and behold, 40 years later, I became her drummer and toured all over the world with Ella Fitzgerald. So what goes around comes around. It was quite an experience to see those two. I'm a very lucky man, really lucky. My first job as a drummer, professional job, at the age of 16, was with Dizzy Gillespie. Now, how lucky can a guy get? A white kid out of Philadelphia, no experience, but I had it all in here. It was all there, built in. No drum lessons, didn't have any drums. It was all built in. I heard it, I could do it. And I went up to Downbeat Club to hear this fantastic trumpeter and the little group that he had up there. And it was a revelation to hear them. It was really, he sounded like Roy Eldridge, but he was taking a left-hand turn. You could hear it. He would run through the changes a little bit different. And I stayed all night, and he came back. As he came off the stand, he started talking to me. And I said, well, I'm a drummer too, you know, cocky little kid. He says, you're a drummer? Well, come on up and play a little bit, which I did. And he liked it.
I mean, Diz was cool. He had these horn-rimmed glasses, and he had this knit bebop hat.
Now, you talk about luck. No experience, but I had the sound. Somehow, it was built in. And he hired me to play with his band in the Downbeat Club in Philadelphia. Talk about luck. But I had the ability to do it. And he knew that, and I'll never forget him for that. He really launched me.
I didn't know he was such a great friend of Dizzy Gillespie, but he must have been because of being asked to play in the famous band that he took. It was an amazing band that he played in.
When he came into the jazz world as a young person at the same time that jazz was transforming and a new, entirely new kind of jazz was beginning to come onto the scene, Stan was very fortunate, or maybe very aggressive or arrogant or whatever, that he got himself onto the scene and began to play at the beginning with the very heart of this new music. Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, it doesn't get any more central than that. But he did. And so he came to it without any preconceptions about what jazz should or shouldn't be, and had the great good fortune to experience this music as it was being born.
At the same time I was in Philadelphia playing at the Downbeat Club, Benny Goodman was at the Earl Theater, and Zoot Sims, who was in the band, used to come and play with us at night. And he liked the way I play, and he told Benny about it, and Benny arranged an audition with the band. And I called my mother and said, Mom, I'm going to be with Benny Goodman at the Earl Theater. She said, shut up. Don't tell me stories like that. I don't want to hear it. I said, Mom, I'm going to be with Benny Goodman 9 o'clock in the morning. Just forget it. Just leave me alone. Leave me alone. So, okay, so the next morning I'm there. I've never been with a big band. I've never been on a stage. I never really had a real set of drums. And there I am with the #1 band in the country. #1, Benny Goodman at that time. Talk about nerve. But I knew his music in my head. I knew it. I knew the records. I knew the feeling of it. Was able to do it. So the curtains opens, and I'm looking at this thing, a cavernous theater. It's enormous, with the red and blue lights. And my God, where am I? And I look down the first row. There's my mother. Her mouth is like 3 feet open. She couldn't believe it, you know. So we got through the show, and Benny is a very weird duck. Was a weird duck. He would introduce everybody but me. So my mother pipes up, "Hey, Benny, who's the drummer?" You know. And I says, "Oh my God, that's her." So that was my first experience, and I did go on the road for a short time with him, and he liked me, but he never spoke to me. Never spoke. When they fired me, his brother Irving Goodman came over and said, "Benny says you should go home." And that was the end. And then after about, I'd say 8 or 10 weeks, Dizzy told me he's going to leave. He's going to New York. And I felt terrible. I felt abandoned, you know. And he did go, and he says, "Will you come to New York? We'll help you get started in New York." Because a kid, I was scared to death, the big city. So we hugged each other goodbye, and he went to New York. And I continued playing. Some of the guys in Philly were John Coltrane, Philly Joe Jones, a bunch of good players, Buddy DeFranco, all good people out of Philly. So I started to think about what Dizzy told me, and there was a trumpet player by the name of Carl Warwick. They call him Bama. Very light-skinned black guy, great guy, great guy. And he encouraged me to go to New York. He said, "Come over, I will help you, and Dizzy will help you." And as scared as I was, I made the move. I had about $1.47, you know, and a train ticket. And I went over there and found Dizzy, and he took me right over to Oscar Pettiford, who was at that time one of the greatest bass players, you know, around. And he said, "Here's your drummer," to Oscar. And Oscar loved Dizzy. He says, "Okay, let's go." So my second night in New York, we got on a train and went to Boston to the Tic-Tac Club. I says, "What happened to New York? I was here and I'm gone." But that was another experience, another piece of luck that I fell into. Again, I was able to do this work.
To hold down the drum chair with Dizzy and Parker and the various people in New York City is something else.
My first job in New York was with Barney Bigard, who was an old style player with Duke Ellington, Dixieland more or less, but it was a job on 52nd Street. I grabbed it. It was wonderful. And actually they liked me, even though I was considered a modernist at that time. I played looser than they did, and got along with them very, very well. And Barney's a great guy, wonderful guy, and he put up with me, you know, whatever. And that was a very, very good learning experience. Then I got a call from Leonard Feather, the English critic, who was well known. And he recognized me as a good drummer, a new guy, a young kid. And he called me to do a record date. And wow, my first record date, first call. I said, "Sure, just tell me where and when." And I borrowed a set of drums. I went up to the Raymond Scott Studios on 52nd Street near 6th Avenue, New York. Got up there, got off the elevator, carrying the drums, went into the studio, and I stopped cold in my tracks. I was there on the piano, sitting there, playing, was Art Tatum, who was the king of kings of the piano. There was none better. There still is today, none better than that. I did a 180, completely turned around. I started to walk out. And Leonard Feather caught me at the elevator, says, "Where are you going? You got to play, you're on this date." I says, "I cannot play with Art Tatum. I mean, I wouldn't even think of it." He says, "Way above my ability." He says, "Get back in there, you can do it, everything will be fine." And I went back and I set up and I played very carefully. It was George Yall on the band, Joe Thomas. Let me see, the guitar player was Chuck Wayne, guys like that. It was kind of a mixmash of a band. And Art Tatum, who was above everybody in the band, and I play very softly and try to just fit in. After the date, Art came over. He was blind. He couldn't really see. He could see a little bit out of the side of his eye. And he put his arm around me because he knew I was nervous as hell, you know. And he says, "You did real, real good, and you're going to be fine." And boy, did that help me for the ongoing career that I had. He saw that fear that I had, and he really made me feel good. And I'll never forget him for that. Great guy.
I'd heard Art Tatum, actually before I came to New York. Art Tatum used to play Buffalo, New York rather regularly at a place called McVan's on the other side of town. I was working at a place called the Anchor Bar right on Main Street in Buffalo. Art Tatum would come to town, and whenever we'd finish our evening at the Anchor Bar, I was working with a small trio, and we'd go over to hear Art's last set at McVan's, and it was always a really amazing experience. You know. You have to struggle for words to describe Art's playing. He was in a class by himself. Technically, innovatively, his ideas, his stamina, his speed, accuracy with both hands, just a phenomenon. And nothing you could say about him really aptly describes his great ability, his great talent.
After we closed the Onyx Club, which was about 4 weeks, I walked down the street towards Fifth Avenue, and there's a club called Tondaleo. It wasn't really a jazz club, but I walked by and I heard this fabulous piano player, just really swinging like crazy. And I walk in, it's a little guy sitting on a telephone booth, you know, telephone book, excuse me, to get him a little higher into the piano. And I'm listening, he sounded like a whole orchestra. It was unbelievable the way he played. After he came off, I introduced myself to him, and he's Earl Gardner, who had just arrived in New York from Pittsburgh. And this guy could really play, and he always could play to the very end. And he was looking for a drummer. So he hired Jimmy Butts on bass and myself on drums.
I had an interesting experience. I was riding down on the subway one day with Earl Garner, who was also working on 52nd Street. And we'd started talking. I asked him the usual silly questions about how do you play the way you play and all that. And he told me, he said, Hank, he says, you know, he said, I learned one thing. It took me 20 years to learn what to leave out. And I thought that was a very profound statement, you know. So you don't have to play all the notes that are possible. There are millions of notes, but you don't have to play every one. Basie proved that, of course.
All this time I was on 52nd Street, working up and down, I'd hear people saying, "The bird is coming." I'm saying, the bird is coming? What bird? A sparrow, a robin, a pigeon? What bird? Charlie Parker.
I went to California in 1945. We was busy after I broke up my band, the first band I had. And I came back again to New York in 47, the early part of 47. And that's when I decided to have a band of my own permanently. And Miles was in my original band. I had Miles, I had Max, I had Tommy Potter, and Al Haig in my band. Mm-hmm. Another band I had Stan Levey, I had Curly Russell, I had Miles, and George Wellington.
The big night came, and about 2 weeks later, and Charlie Parker was here. Well, he looked like he just rolled off a garbage truck. There was something so bad in my life. His shoes didn't match. Looks like he slept in his suit for about a month, and his hair standing straight up. Looked like Don King. And there he was. I said, my God, what is this guy? What can he do? How good is he? He's like a legend already. And on Monday nights in the Downbeat Club on 52nd Street, they had an open jam session. And him and I walked in. I met him. We kind of talked for a while. And we walked into the Downbeat Club. And he took out his horn, which was in a paper bag, full of rubber bands and cellophane to keep it together, and sat in. Well, within 4 bars, everybody went absolutely crazy because he was then the Charlie Parker that he is now. He was already so far advanced of everybody. It was amazing, absolutely amazing. So he gave me a little motion like that because the drummer was a older type drummer, you know. He said, come on up and play, give me the eye. And I did, the guy let me play. And as soon as we played like 8 bars together, we were like this. We knew we were musically bonded. It was the weirdest experience I ever had. I had that with Dizzy, but I really had it with Parker. And amazing experience, out of body experience. We used to play all night on 52nd Street. We'd have a job here, a job there. And then we'd go up to Minton's and start playing about 8, 9 o'clock in the morning and play till 2. Then knock it off, try to get some rest. And we became very fast friends. In fact, we moved in together in Harlem, around 121st Street. We got a place together. And it was a madhouse because we were going all night, all day. It was all music, you know. And the best time I ever had musically with him.
There was nothing to do but play, you know, and we had a lot of fun trying to play, you know. I did. Plenty of jam sessions. Meant much late hours. Plenty good food. Just nice, clean living, you know. But basically speaking, much poverty.
Well, living with Charlie Parker as I did was like living in the eye of a hurricane. It never stopped. Just faster and faster and more playing. Of course, there was a lot of drugs involved in those days. Everybody did that, and we did it too, and a little bit to excess, I would say. But we had our share. But the music that we played was just beyond belief. It was all new, all wonderful, and we had the best time doing it. And we didn't make much money, but we had a lot of good times, a lot of good music.
I think one of the first times I heard Charlie Parker was when I was in the Army. I came home on furlough, and the guy I grew up called Tiny Khan took me to hear Charlie Parker. And I heard him a few times. I was on furlough. I heard him with Max Roach, and I heard him with Stan Levey. And what I do remember, I'll never forget with Stan, because I didn't know him in those days, whatever tune they were playing, sometimes Charlie Parker would play 30 choruses, and then Dizzy would play 30 choruses, then Al Haig would play 30 choruses, and Stan would be sitting there playing, am I doing the left hand? Yeah. He'd be yelling, take it out, take it out.
Dizzy came by one night, I think at the time he was working with Cab Calloway's band, and he sat in the band, and I was quite fascinated with the fellow, and we became very good friends, and until this day we are, you know? But that was the first time I ever had the pleasure to meet Dizzy Gillespie.
Was he playing the same way then? Before he played with you?
I don't remember precisely. I just know that he was playing what you might call in the vernacular of the streets, a buku of horn, you know?
Buku?
Yeah.
Okay.
You know, just like all of the horn packed up in once, you know? And we used to go around different places and jam together. We had quite a bit of fun in those days.
The music has different stages of development. There was King Oliver on the trumpet, and then after that there came Louis Armstrong on the trumpet, and it was a little different, but he sounded very close to King Oliver. And then there came Roy Eldridge, who he played a lot of the style of Louis Armstrong, remember that? And then I came along, and then there was Miles and Fats Navarro, came 2 of them, but they were trying to play like me. You know, so all of us got our. I tried to play like Roy Eldridge. Everybody's got their hero, you know.
But I heard Dizzy, Art Blakey, Bird, Lucky Thompson, Sarah, Gene Ammons. I heard all of them at once. I said, that's the most fun I ever had with my clothes on. I said, God damn, can you imagine that? Now I'm 15. But see, we were on the verge of that anyway. I knew they were playing, but I mean, it wasn't Dizzy first, it was the whole thing together, like, bam, here's what you want to be, you know? And my head just carried me right to Bird and Dizzy.
In the same building that Miles and I lived in, right below us was Billie Holiday. On the same floor was Sarah Vaughan. A whole bunch of guys, Freddie Webster, a fine trumpet player. So it was kind of a musical enclave, and it was really fun. We all got along beautifully, and there was some good music that came out of that.
We didn't have much money, so I would tell Irene, I'd say, now fix some cornbread, and we'd buy some cabbage, put potatoes in, you know, like cabbage. Bird come downstairs. Right now, the cornbread is this big, right? And we don't have no money, just a little bit of it, right? So I said, Bird, you want something to eat? He come in. Now, cornbread is like this, right? You cut this half, yeah, and eat the rest. He just took everything to the extreme. That's the reason he was like he is, what he is.
I remember you, man, seeing Stan Levey's name all with Bird and all of that. You guys were like the old, the first team, man. I mean, we were little greenback punks coming in from Seattle, you know, just glad to get to New York to be able to watch everybody do their thing, because we just heard stories. Because people forget back in that day, there was no MTV or anything to tell anybody what was going on. There was probably one jazz station in Seattle we could catch, was Jimmy Lyons from San Francisco, and the Downbeat magazine. But I finally got to New York, and word of mouth we'd hear things, and I finally got to New York. Oscar Pettiford took me there the first time to do two arrangements, and he took me to all the joints, and one of the joints where you were at Minton's, which was the Mecca. That's where everything was happening. And I used to see you guys go through the New York rituals, man. Like they'd have 20 guys sitting around with horns and sacks and all kind of stuff, paper sacks. And Bird was call them demons. And so they all jump up on the stand and will say they played with Bird. And as he's kicking off, he said, "Be natural." In the key of "Be natural." And you guys were flying along, and the stage emptied quick, because that's a half step up from what everybody ever knew how to play it.
I remember working with one of the finest drummers, perhaps the finest drummer in New York. And I'm sure if he was here, he would agree with me, Stan Levey. He was working with a group, the Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Parker group, at a club in New York called Clark Monroe's Spotlight on 52nd Street, sometimes known as Spring Street. They had because on either side of the street for a block and perhaps a block and a half, there were clubs on both sides of the street. You could walk in one right across the street, walk in the other, back and forth all night, you know. But Stan was working with the group, and I was lucky enough to be included in that group for a short time.
I remember getting the first few Dial record company records that I ever had. Charlie Parker was playing on them. Wardell Gray and Dexter Gordon were playing some two tenor things. When I heard Charlie Parker play, I said, "What the hell is that going on?" My goodness, so inventive. I mean, he was coming out of left field and didn't sound like anybody. Didn't sound like he was influenced by anybody. I'm sure he was, but you couldn't tell it from the notes that were coming out.
During our engagement on 52nd Street with Dizzy and Charlie Parker, a young fella used to come around every night and copy down chords and listening and listening and listening and listening. He was a young trumpet player by the name of Miles Davis, who later became an icon. And every night he got a little more aggressive as far as talking to us and coming back. And one night he came back to the dressing room and he came up to Dizzy. He said, "Dizzy, I can play anything you can play." And Dizzy said, "Yeah, but an octave lower."
My influence mostly was Dizzy. But also first it was Clark Terry.
St. Louis trumpet player.
Yeah. St. Louis is a place when the big bands used to come in town and up from New Orleans on the boat. And if the big bands, when they needed a trumpet player, they would stop in St. Louis. And I was 15 when I was playing professional. I had a union card when I was 15. But it was mostly Bruz, Eddie Randall, Clark Terry, Levi. That was it. And another guy named Cliff King. But that's it. When the big band needed a trumpet player or a show drummer, you know, they would come when they stopped in St. Louis, they would pick up a trumpet player. So they wanted me but I couldn't go anywhere.
Across the street from the Downbeat Club where Parker and I were playing on Mondays and Tuesdays or whatever, there was a tenor player by the name of Ben Webster. I'm sure you'll heard of him. He was Duke Ellington's player. He played Cottontail, a great player of that era. And he heard that we were over there. We were the latest thing, so he wanted to have us in the band, which he did. He hired us. And the first night went pretty well, and the second night, Ben likes to drink, and he got a little stoned, you know. And he called Cottontail, and it's a pretty fast tune, and he couldn't play it, you know. And Parker just took over and played the whole thing perfectly, you know, his solo. So he got a little peed off on that one, and he started looking at his phone. He's a gigantic guy, Ben Webster, strong, big guy. And he said, he turned around, he said, you two guys, you two get the hell out of here. And we were fired the second night.
I've never been so enraptured or fascinated in my life as the days when the rules were being made and the guys were carving out the catechism of what the new music was all about. Because it was music that took over and it revolutionized the music in the world.
When you talk about bebop music, and we know it came out of the African American or black musical context, but even more importantly than that is that jazz was stale for a minute. Musicians were rebelling against the form that was prior to bebop. So what happens is that due again to the creativity involved in jazz music, to the evolving processes of jazz music, things take place. And these great musicians found ways in time and tempo to create new music, music unheard of at the time. You look back on it and you say, well, I can do that. But in the 1940s and late 1930s, this was new music. The music was so new that people didn't understand it. It took about a decade or two that people really understood what bebop was.
At that time, it wasn't terribly popular with most people, as a matter of fact. Stan would probably verify that, because a lot of people, including some musicians, rejected the style, maybe because it was too different, and you know, people hate to change. There's sort of a built-in resistance to people for change, even if it's good. And if it's particularly difficult to do, there's more resistance. I think that might have been the problem. But eventually it did catch on. That's the type of music that we call bebop.
You know, if you see transcribed pages of bebop solos, the ink is so, there's so much ink there you can't even see the white paper. It takes a person, if you can play, that's what counts for me. Of course, then you have to have the talent and the sentimentality or whatever the other emotions are. But the main thing is you got to know your acts.
Bebop was much more than just the music, you know. It was a way of speaking, the colloquialisms. It was a sensibility. There was the slangs that were like opposites. I remember saying one night at Newport or something, I said, how was so-and-so? I said, oh man, he was terrible, man. Which meant great. And this man's wife was telling me, so, oh man, did you, Quincy was talking bad about you. I said, he's bad, you know. That's, at that time, it was, the opposites were, you know, that was the colorful slang then.
About a month down the line, after we got through playing these little clubs with Parker and such, Dizzy called, and he said, we're going to do a band with Charlie Parker, me, Stan Levey, me, and Curly Russell and Al Haig. And wow, I said, this can't be real. This is earth-shaking, and it was. And we started rehearsing in the Three Deuces in the afternoon. And Dizzy brought in all this music, you know, Confirmation, Bebop, all the tunes that he did. And Al Haig was incredible. And the band immediately gelled. Within 30 minutes, it was together. It was a done deal. It was a perfect package. We rehearsed maybe 2 or 3 days, and then we opened in the Three Deuces, and everything broke loose, chaotic. People couldn't get in the door. It just went crazy for about 8 weeks, the whole time we were there. The last 2 weeks of the engagement with Dizzy and Charlie Parker in New York, I got a call from Woody Herman's manager. Now, Woody Herman at that time was the #1 band in the country, in the world. Tremendous. And he offered me $250 a week, which at that time was an unbelievable amount of money. And I went to Dizzy and said, man, what should I do? This guy's going to offer me $250, but I'm making $66 a week with Dizzy. And the kind of guy Dizzy is, he just says, just go and take it. When you come back, your job will be here. And I went to play with this #1 big band in the world, and I couldn't read music, and I didn't have any drums. So I played on Davy Tuff's set, and I got by pretty well. They liked me pretty good. I was out about 2 months with the band. Davy had gotten sick. And when I came back, Dizzy had done the record dates that I wanted to do. Salt Peanuts, that whole group for Musicraft, which I missed. Big Sid Catlett did them and did a great, great job, a fantastic job. And I was really sorry I missed those. I should have been on that. But that's the kind of guy Dizzy was. Go get the money. Go get it.
I think that both he and Max Roach, obviously had a powerful impact. Max Roach certainly much better known at that time than Stan was, but if you listen to Stan's playing from that period, there was a lot of similarity between those two players. The other thing that comes to mind about that aspect of his career is that he was playing, and again, I think had the good fortune to be part of a scene at a time when a lot of the racial problems that began to emerge later were not as present as they have since become, so that as a white player, as a young white drummer, he was able to play with African Americans, and everybody loved everybody. And as he has said, with Dizzy, it was a matter of whether you could cut the music or not. If you could play it, then you deserved to be there. If you didn't, then you didn't. And that was a great experience for a young drummer to have. Things changed later, of course, but at that time, I can't think of a better opportunity than to have been able to grow up as a young musician playing with Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie. That's magical.
When you talk about whites playing with blacks, it's really not that important. What really is important is the music and how well they played the music, and that's the key. And in this case, you had Stan Levey playing with the pioneers, Bird, Diz, Miles, and he was right there. Why was Stan there? Well, simply put, Stan was an outstanding drummer. He knew the pace of the music. He knew the feeling of bebop. And this had a lot to do with that whole concept. It wasn't so much a racial thing unless people made it a racial thing. But white musicians were playing with black musicians, a long time, still do.
I was hired to join a big band at Child's Restaurant in Times Square, right under the Paramount Theater. It was called Henry Jerome, and they played for dancing mostly. But they had some great, great jazz players in that band. It was tremendous. They had Al Cohen, Normie Faye, Jack Eagle, guys like that. Very, very good players. Zoot Sims was in the band. One of the tenor players was Leonard Garment, who was very, very good, and he later became the law partner of Richard Nixon. So he was in the White House for quite a long time and had quite some escapades in the White House. And the baritone player was Alan Greenspan, who is now the head of the Fed. He runs the money. And of course, at that time, he was the paymaster of the band. He used to pay us and keep track of all the money. So again, pretty interesting stuff, how these guys evolved into what they became. In my very early days in Philadelphia, as I told you, my father was a fight manager. He had about 18 fighters. He had a couple of world champions, too. And I would always hang around the gyms with him, and I became like a mascot. I was only about 12, 13 years old. And the fighters kind of took to me. I was a nice-looking kid. I was pretty well built at that time. And I would get in the ring with world champ Bob Montgomery, Ike Williams, and they would show me moves and things like that, skipping the rope, how to feint, how to jab. Inadvertently, I amassed this information. I was able to do this. And as I got older, I took a couple of bouts, you know, 4-round fights, and I was a heavyweight. I was 176 pounds. In those days, that was the heavyweight division. And I was pretty good, too. I would win some not. Unfortunately, in those times, I had to deal with the guys that ran the business. They were the gangster type guys, you know, like you see in the old movies. Well, they were for real. My father was part of that too. He would do business with them, and if you wanted your fighter to work, you had to do that. You had to deal with them. They sometimes would tell me when to lose, but they never told me. They would come into the dressing room with the big hat and the big overcoat and lay a couple of fingers down, like 3 or 2. And that was the round you had to go down, but nothing was ever spoken, but you knew you had to do it. And to go down, to lose, you had to get hit. You had to take the shot. You didn't just fall down. We did get paid for doing that. They would bet for us, against me, against myself. Even though I felt that I could beat the other fighter, you did what you were told to do. And it all worked out. We got extra money, and I didn't get my legs broken either. So it all worked out fine. I'd like to tell you about my first trip to California. Dizzy called me after we had done all this work in New York and everything, and he says, we're going to California. We got an 8-week job there, and it should be very interesting. It's nice out there. The weather is good, and so we're ready to go. And I said, well, we're going to have the same band. He says, yeah, except we're not taking Curly Russell. Now, Curly Russell is the bass player, and we had worked together for a long time. And we traded off carrying the band. In other words, the ferocious tempos that we played. In some cases, he would take over a little bit, then I would relieve him a bit, you know, as far as putting the edge on the music, on the rhythm. So he says, no, Curly's not going. I said, why? He said, I'm hiring a young guy by the name of Ray Brown. I says, uh-oh, I'm in trouble. I had no idea who he was or what he was or anything. I said, Dizzy, why are you taking apart the rhythm section that we had that worked so well? He says, I found this kid in Detroit and he's fantastic. I said, well, it's your band. Do what you want. And I worried about that for a while. And then the band we took out was Charlie Parker, Stan Levey, Ray Brown, Milt Jackson, Dizzy Gillespie, and we got on the train. And the train ride was a disaster because in those days, you had to go to Chicago first, and then you laid over for a couple of hours, and then that was the 20th Century Limited, and then you took the train to California. And I met this young guy, a pretty cocky guy, this Ray Brown. I didn't know how he played. And Milt Jackson, I knew nothing about him at all. And we're on the train, and we stopped for water. In those days, they had a water stop where there was a steam engines, and we had to get water. And we're stopping, and the train is hissing and all the noise it makes. And I look out the window. I see this little speck out there with a little suitcase. I'm saying, man, it's a desert. What is this guy doing out there? I looked real close, and it was Charlie Parker, walking in the desert. And I said to Dizzy, I think you better look at this. And he looked out there, and he says, what is it? And I said, I think it's your saxophone player, Charlie Parker. He said, well, you better go get him. I said, wait a minute, it's your band. He said, no, you go get him. You're his friend. And I ran out. It was about maybe 200 yards out there. He was staggering around. He was ill. He didn't have his medicine or whatever. And let him know that there's nothing out there he can get. Nothing's going to help him. So I got him back on the train, and he was a mess all the way back. And we finally pulled into Union Station, and he was like a zombie, you know, really sick. And that was our first trip to California, L.A. And I was still worrying about the bass player because it was quite important, you know, the ferocious, speedy tempos that we played. And they also added Lucky Thompson on tenor in case Parker didn't come in on time, which he very seldom did. And the first night, Dizzy beats off a real fast tune.
Billy Berg's. It was a hell of an experience, but we upset California, the music lovers in California. We were there for 8 weeks, and went away, and we came back, and I came back with a big band and played there, and that was a profound experience there, because a lot of the movie stars came out, such as Ava Gardner.
Dizzy beat off the first tune of the night at a ferocious tempo, really, really fast. And we got right into it, and it was flying. And I hear this great bass sound coming through, which I'd never heard before. Every note clear as a bell, and the tempos are right there. And boy, I just looked at that kid and just grinned. He grinned over at me, and he was what he became later, Ray Brown. Great, great bass player. So we had Al Haig on piano, Ray Brown, and myself. That was a pretty good rhythm section.
They say that they weren't very well received, but I think they were, because they were, I mean, it was a very underground thing. I think New York was a few years ahead of Los Angeles in that particular thing.
We did good business there because they had never heard this type of music, bebop or whatever you want to call it. They always had like Slim and Slam, comedy acts and stuff like that, Harry the Hipster, you know. And we had all the movie stars come in every night. Jennifer Jones, all these kind of, Ava Gardner, every night in there. Peter Lawford. And when we first got there, Billy Berg says, well, who's the singer? Well, we didn't have a singer. But the only thing we sang was Salt Peanuts, where Dizzy sang Salt Peanuts, Salt Peanuts. And that was about it. So Billy Berg had bought a band that he didn't know about. He didn't know the style of it. But we did a pretty good business. All the musicians came. Quite a good experience. Also, through the 8 weeks that we were there, Charlie Parker was going downhill, downhill, downhill. He couldn't get the right drugs that he needed to keep him going. And he just started drinking heavier and eating heavier, and he was a mess. Finally, the job was over after the 8 weeks, and Dizzy gave me all the plane tickets. We came back by plane this time. 21 stops, up and down, up and down. Took about 20 hours to come back by plane in those days. That was 1945. And I couldn't find Charlie Parker. I went to the hotel, he wasn't there. I went out, took a cab, something about $20, $30. In those days, that was a lot of money for a cab. Could not find him anywhere. So I left the ticket at the hotel, at the desk for him. He never got it. He never showed up. He never got on the plane. We just left and went back to New York, and he got in big trouble here. He wound up getting arrested, setting fire to his room, drunk, and wound up in the Camarillo for about a year. They got him pretty well straightened out. And the next time I saw him was about a year or so later. In New York, he had bloated up. He was real, real heavy, and a very subdued Charlie Parker. Another musician that I met, who was quite unknown in those days, about 1947, was Stan Getz. We became friends, and he hired me to do a record date with him, and along with a couple of jobs that we did together. And those were his first dates that were really big sellers. Long Island Sound was one of them, and quite a few others. Of course, Stan went on to become the big bossa nova king.
One of my all-time influences was Stan Getz and Al Cohn and Zoot Sims. I just thought the four-brother tenor section that Woody Herman had was so incredible, never to be duplicated. I remember once I was playing on a Sunday at the Peacock Alley on 8th Street, which was my steady job that supported me. And in the door walks one day Stan Getz and a friend of his, and they sit down at the bar to have a drink and listen. Well, I'm really on the spot now. I went up to Stan to say hello, and he said, yeah, he even does look like me a little bit. And I thought, isn't that interesting? So I played. Then I asked him if he'd like to sit in and use my horn, and he said, okay. So it came up, and it just made my old con sound like it was the best. And later, he and I hung outside and talked and laughed about music, and he came and sat in, played some more. I also played, of course. And he paid me a compliment. He looked at me and says, yeah, little Stan, you and me And I thought that was so nice.
In 1948, I joined a band called Boyd Rayburn, which was kind of an avant-garde orchestra. And they had a lot of good players in that band. Frankie Sokolow, Lou Levy, who was Ella's pianist, and Peggy Lee. We were very young then. And we went to Galveston, Texas, and we worked on the pier for about 2 or 3 weeks. Then we came back by bus to New York. I got off the bus, we checked all the drums, all the instruments, and that was the end of the job. And I went down to Birdland, and I saw this really pretty little girl. She looked about 20 or 21, very, very pretty. And she was the ticket taker. And I struck up a conversation, as I'm like to do, and went in to watch whoever, I think Bud Powell was working there, something like that. And about 2 in the morning, I left, and she was getting done. I said, would you like to get some coffee or hot chocolate or something? And she said, fine. I think she kind of liked me. And we went over to Whalen's Drugstore on Broadway. I'll never forget it. About 3 in the morning, and did a lot of talking and talking and talking. And I said, where are you living? And she says, in this hotel, and I forget the name, but she says, can I come up? She says, no. So that was an ominous start. Anyway, I said, well, call me. I'm at the Century Hotel, and give me a call tomorrow. Thinking that she probably wouldn't, you know. And lo and behold, the phone rings. I was expecting another young lady to call by the name of Ginger. I says, hi, Ginger. He says, no, this is Angela. I says, uh-oh. I blew it. So anyway, we started talking, and we got together again, had some lunch, talk, and finally, we just fell in love, like immediately, you know. We were like together. It's just like that. And we roomed together, which in those days was risque, boy. You didn't do that. And I had a bit of a drug problem, which she didn't really understand what that was. She thought it was like drinking or having a beer or something, or having a good time. A little more than that. Anyway, our life, we've been together 53 years now, so things kind of worked out pretty good. One of the jobs I had was with Billie Holiday. I was her drummer, and she was really something at that time. The clubs along 52nd Street were very, very noisy, a lot of noise and carrying on. And when she appeared, the room would go dark, and there'd be a little pin spot, and she would walk into that pin spot, and boy, the silence was deafening when she walked on stage. She was really a fantastic person. She had a great aura about her and control without even opening her mouth. It just controlled the whole room. And she was quite a character and quite a nice girl, actually. Had a tough life, very tough.
She was right there with this sound that no one else had. There was no one who sang like Billie Holiday. No one. She was that important. She had that much emotion that left people in tears. People just said, why is she so sad? But she was emotional in terms of the vocal context of the song.
We all had a dressing room upstairs with Coleman Hawkins and Billy. And my first night with the band, I saw this white powder on a mirror, and they're all sniffing it up. And I found out what that was. That was pretty interesting for a young guy to see that stuff. And it was quite an experience on 52nd Street, especially with Coleman Hawkins. He had a great band, terrific band. And Billy was great to me, and we got along quite well. Back in 1947, there was a young fellow by the name of Norman Granz. He used to put on concerts at the Philharmonic and called them Jazz at the Philharmonic. And he had all the big names, Parker, Gillespie, Lester Young, on and on. And he called me, I was in New York, and he called me to join him for a tour from New York to California, first cross-country tour. And I was happy to do it. It only paid $25 a night. You had to pay your own room and board, and it wasn't much, but the enjoyment of doing it. We had no band boy because of the money situation, and Norman would help me run for the train with the drums. The two of us would get the drums on the train. And he was very, very successful later on. And I worked for him with Ella Fitzgerald. I did 2 years with Ella under his guidance. And he became a very good friend of mine, and he passed recently, and we all miss him. He was a real entrepreneur, and he broke the color line. We would get booked into a hotel in Chicago or Toledo somewhere, and we'd show up, a mixed group, and the manager would say, well, I don't think we have the rooms. Norman would say, look, we made the reservation 2 months ago. We want our rooms, and we did get them. He was quite a guy.
Norman Granz, I must say, did a lot for jazz during that period. He probably did more during that period for jazz than any other promoter or entrepreneur, certainly more than some of the band leaders of that period. For one thing, he made it mandatory that the audiences, particularly in the South, were integrated, that is, Afro-Americans and white. He would not play a concert if there was segregation in the audience. And that's one of the things I don't think he gets enough credit for that, because it happened during a period which was prior to the civil rights movement. So he was, in a sense, sticking his neck out, taking a chance, but it worked for him. Because I think jazz was the overriding concern of everybody. People were interested in jazz. They were not interested, at least the people who came to the concerts, they were not interested in segregation and all that stuff, you know. So, in other words, jazz became the bridge. Jazz is the great bridge between cultures, between ethnic groups, between political differences. All those things become secondary when you play jazz. So jazz is really a great dominating force, and I don't think people realize that.
At the end of this tour, I realized that I had to be in court a day earlier than I thought, due to a narcotics violation. Norman refused payment of my fare for the lost day, even though I got him Shelly Manne to finish. Parker volunteered to lend me the money with my drums as security, and this note is self-explanatory. After I had finished the time that I owed the government for my misadventures, I came back and I went to Philadelphia. First I went to Washington, D.C. to see Angela, and we got back together, and then I went to Philly, my hometown, and I was able to put together a band through the help of some people that knew me. And the band was really terrific. It was Richie Kamuki on tenor, Nelson Boyd on bass, who was with Dizzy, and Red Garland, the great piano player, with Miles Davis. And it was really, really a good band. And we backed every singer that came into Philly, Ella Fitzgerald, Sarah Vaughan, on and on and on. All the acts that came in, they all asked for our quartet, you know? And that was really great. And we enjoyed it, and the band sounded fabulous. And then we were playing at the Click Club, I believe, or something like that. I think that's the name. I can't recall. And we were with Ella Fitzgerald and Ella we closed that night. And Stan Kenton came in right after us the next day. And then things started to happen. I got to hear Stan Kenton's band, which I had never really heard in person. It was kind of a stiff West Coast band, in my estimation. I didn't really like it. When I heard the band, there was some new music being played, and music of Bill Holman, which was kind of changing the atmosphere and the feeling of the band. It was a little more loose, things like that. Well, I knew all the guys on the band, Conte Condoli, Buddy Childers, Bill Holman, guys like that. They suggested to Stan that he hire me. And Stan had heard that I just got out, you know, a few months ago. And he's a great guy. He said, fine, you okay? That's all he ever said to me. Are you okay? I said, yeah, I'm okay. And he says, fine, you start in 2 weeks.
Half the band was young guys that really hadn't had much experience, and the thought of having one of the bebop classic
players joined the band was kind of scary to a lot of us. Half the band was old, seasoned road players, and they probably just took it as another happening on the road, but a lot of us were really impressed and kind of intimidated. And anyway, Stan came in and he brought a lot of talent. I don't know how much big band experience he'd had, but he realized that the role of a drummer was to make the band swing, and that was the thing he could do.
I really didn't have that much big band experience. I mean, working with Benny Goodman was kind of a swing, almost Dixie swing type of thing. You know, back in, his music was in the 30s, 40s. This was modern, and there was a big band, 10 brass, a very loud band. I didn't have the control yet to control that band, to move it around the way it should be moved. It took me a while to do it, a couple of weeks, and but I got the knack right away. And the other thing was the reading. I wasn't that good at reading, but I did learn quickly. I picked right up on it. Because seeing it on paper and hearing it, you put the two together, earn while you learn, okay? That worked out very, very good for me, and the band got better and better and better and better till it was just, by 1953, it was dynamite. We went to Europe and tore up the whole place.
On the 52, 53 band that I played in, we had all the great soloists. Conde Condoli on trumpet, Lee Konitz, alto sax, Zoot Sims on tenor sax, which is hanging out with Zoot was the high point of, one of the high points of my life, really, because I got a lot out of him.
He really is one of the very important creators of the School of Modern Music, a guy that's achieving tremendous things with an alto saxophone, Lee Konitz.
I joined the Stan Kenton Band in 1952 with Richie Kamuka. Stan had called me and told me that Stan Levey was going to be on the band, and Conde Condoli and Frank Rossellino and Bill Holman. I thought, well, big bands weren't really my favorite place to be. Being a saxophone player sitting in front of 10 brass is not an enviable place to be, I must say.
I joined the band as a tenor saxophone player, and Stan was very encouraging. He said, he kept after me to write, and I didn't know what to write because I didn't want to or didn't know how to write the progressive jazz that he had been doing in the 40s. And I knew that he didn't want Count Basie arrangements because he said so. And so I had to try to figure out a way that I could make my writing work with his band. And so I didn't write anything for about the first 9 months I was on the band. And but in the meantime, I was playing all these Jerry Mulligan charts, which had come on the band about the same time I did. And just playing those things night after night really gave me a lot of insight on how really good writers put arrangements and compositions together. Started writing, and Stan kept encouraging me, and he paid me for everything that I wrote, whether it was any good or not. And eventually I was able to retain enough of the jazz feel that I had, and yet make it palatable for him, for Stan, you know, and I give him credit because he knew that his original idea for the band was getting away from him.
Well, in Kenton's orchestra, you know, there are certain guys that relate to the audience right away, and they were playing bebop. But normally that wouldn't be what they would play in that orchestra, because his was a grand orchestra. Things ba 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 da 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 ba ba, you know. Then you hear out of that this trombone player that would be playing his solo, and it would be something else altogether. So it connected with the audience.
Playing drums with Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie was enormously different from playing drums for Stan Kenton. Big band, a lot of brass, not known for their capacity to have a particularly propulsive sense of swing. Although when Stan was playing with them, somehow he managed to sneak some of it in. And again, that was another part of his very special talent.
I've heard a lot of drummers play with that band, well, a few drummers, and they all sounded good. But when you have to play with, I think, maybe 10 or 12 brass and 5 saxophones and 84 rhythm, you have to have that energy. And Stan, well, I didn't believe how good he sounded with the band. He had all that energy and strength. He really carried that band. And to me, any band that I have, the drummer is the leader of the band. He's the most important guy in a band. He's the first guy you hire in a band. And Stan was in that band, even though Stan Kenton may have stood in front of the band, Stan Levey was the leader of that band.
Well, I love Stan Kenton. He was great guy, and he always traveled with the band. And we'd have Bud Brisboy and Frank Huggins and Billy Catalano, but 5 trumpets, I think. And we'd be playing as loud and as high as we could. And Stan would be going out in front saying, you know, give us more. And Bud Brisboy would be, you know, passing out. In fact, Stan Kenton had the record of sidemen suicides. Yeah, Frank Rosalino killed himself, Bud Brisboy killed himself, shot himself, Ann Richards shot herself, Art Pepper kept shooting himself over and over again.
Some of the players in the band were very, very good. Kamuka, I got Kamuka in the band from my band. I told Stan to hire him, which he did. And the writing was the most important thing. Bill Holman was tremendous. He wrote in a linear way. In other words, the lines, the musical lines were long, not choppy the way Kenton's band had been. And it took Stan a while to get used to hearing that. And Mulligan kind of wrote the same way. I think they fed off of each other. And some of the charts that he wrote were just incredible for that band. Just terrific. And then we got Lee Konitz in, Zoot Sims, people, Conti Condoli, and a lot of those guys I worked with at the Lighthouse later on when I left Stan. That would be Condoli, Rosalino, and Richie Kamuka. And we went on to have a really good, tight group.
I always gave credit to Stan, whose music might have been a little esoteric to some, but still he had a sound in his mind, and he pursued it and became a big-time, you better believe it, big-time star as an orchestra leader. He might not have been the world's greatest jazz piano player, that's admitted by many people, and but so what? The band was just a wonderful experiment and made possible by Stan's personality. He wasn't afraid to stand up and say what he wanted to say.
I'm so sorry that his life ended the way it did, because he had this alcohol problem, which I really wasn't aware of. I never saw him drink. But obviously he was drinking, and you know, as you get older, you can't control it. But I was and he died really relatively broke and things like that, and it made me feel bad, because he took a chance on me. He saw that I had the ability, and he took a chance to let me do what I could do. He never said, do this, do that. He says, just do it. Are you okay? Yes. Go, let's go. I mean, that's a great guy.
You know, when people talk about West Coast jazz, you really are talking about something that basically is different. And the reason it was different is because the West Coast symbolized cool, you know, the coolness of the people, the coolness of the music. And I would say the seminal West Coast document was Miles Davis's Birth of the Cool on Capitol Records in 1957, even though Stan was not a part of that. But it was like a movement that was taking place the late 40s and 50s here in Los Angeles. And it made a statement, a tremendous statement. Some of the greatest jazz musicians ever, Stan Levey included, were a part of West Coast jazz, so to speak.
At the end of one of the big tours that we had with Nat Cole and Sarah Vaughan and Dizzy, it was called The Big Show, the band came to LA and we played our last date. And the band was going to break up for about 2 weeks at that time. When I reached the LA airport, they were paging me in the airport. I said, oh my God, what happened, you know? And I went to the red phone, picked it up, and it was Max Roach, my old friend from New York. He says, Stan. I said, yeah, Max, what's going on? He says, look, I'm working at the Lighthouse. You got to get me out of here. I said, what do you mean? He says, well, I have a 6-month contract with Howard Rumsey, and they won't let me leave unless I get a suitable replacement. And you're the guy. They said they'll settle on you. So I never went into LA. I got a cab, went right to the Lighthouse in Hermosa Beach, and started talking with Max and Howard and the owner, John Levine. And we settled on a price. And the next day, Max was gone, and I started, and I lived right at the beach. That was the beginning of a good, long relationship with Howard and the Lighthouse.
In the 10 years that I was on that stand, the drum chair went from Carl Kiffey to Ramo Bailey to Larry Bunker to Shelly Man to Stan Levey, no, to Max Roach, and then Stan Levey, and the final drummer was Nick Martinez. And the 5 years that I spent on the stand with Stan Levey were the best 5 years of the period. And when I think back about it, I understand that I really didn't need to worry when I had Stan, because he knew all the best players and he knew the right guys, and in essence, it was really Stan contracting the band. There were no real contracts. That was the best part about the job. Guys could come and go.
The first day that I ever saw Stan Levey in person was early August 1956. I had just turned 19 the week before, and I had left Houston, Texas to come out to the West Coast to get into the jazz scene out here. I went immediately, upon arriving in LA, I went immediately to the Lighthouse, where Howard Rumsey had a band, Howard Rumsey and the Lighthouse All-Stars, and it was a great band. It consisted of Frank Rossellino on trombone, Bob Cooper on tenor saxophone, the great Sonny Clark, one of the great jazz piano players, on piano, and Stan Levey on drums.
The thing that stands out most in my mind is the very same thing that I think about today when I think of Stan Levey. It was this really articulate, beautiful, like airy kind of sound with the time like just right up here in your chin. Just beautiful, and no fooling around. Not a lot of chitter chatter in the same way that you would hear other drummers playing with the left hand and stuff. But he had his conversation with the left hand was really, I just remember that it was very articulate and it was very like purposeful. And then the other thing I remember was the pretty way he dropped bombs on the bass drum. And I really always loved that. And today, even when I listen to him play on records that I wasn't even aware of then, the dizzy stuff and all that.
Stan was so beautiful to me. Invited me over to his house, which I think was in Redondo Beach at the time. Spent the night and let me sit in with the Lighthouse All-Stars the last set or so on weeknights, and generally mentored my whole week there. And it was a situation that I'll never forget, and I was so fortunate to have that kind of man give me his time at that time in my life.
When I was very young, when I first saw him play, he intimidated me. I thought that he was kind of a scary guy, and I would never wanted to go up and talk to him like I would have Mel Lewis or Hal Blaine, or even Shelley. There's something about Stan that was dangerous. There was a dangerous thing about him, and I didn't know what it was.
All of the young musicians on the scene out here in Los Angeles at that time were in awe of Stan and a little bit intimidated, and there were some reasons for that. One, everybody knew that he had been with the greatest jazz players that ever lived, Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie. And two, I mean, on the beginning of the modern way to play. And two, he was still, at that time, one of the great jazz drummers. He was making albums in like, For Musicians Only with Dizzy Gillespie, Stan Getz, and Sonny Stitt, which is a classic album now, and many, many other records like that. He was still at the top of his game and playing really well. And then the third thing was his physical appearance, which was very intimidating because he was this big guy, 6'2", something, and everybody knew that he had been a professional fighter, a good one, and he looked like he could take you out in 5 seconds or less. And he also had this very gruff exterior, which underneath it he wasn't like that. He was, very witty and funny, but you didn't get to know that until you got to know him a little bit.
But Stan was always great, and it was great to have Stan in the band because he was like a big boxer, and nobody ever fooled with the band. We always got paid and everything. Stan never had to do anything. He would just stand in the corner and look, make a face.
I'd like to explain what the Lighthouse was. It was an experimental place. Howard Rumsey had been there for many years prior to my getting there, and he had mostly the guys from the Kenton band, like Milt Bernhardt, Shorty Rogers, people like that.
Bob Cooper and June Christie and Claude Williamson, I think, was playing the piano, and Howard was doing the bass, of course, as only he could do, the way that we did.
When I went in, we had me, Howard, Claude Williamson, Frank Rossellino, Conti Gandoli, and Bob Cooper. That's a pretty good band. Also Bud Shank. And Howard was a wide open guy. He would allow you to do whatever you felt you could do within reason. If he didn't like it, he would tell you, of course. But it was a very good place to work out your music. If you wrote something, you could bring it in. They would always play it. And if it sounded good, it would go into the book.
Stan brought in Conti and Richie Kamuka and players from the Kenton organization, which we found to be very dependable and musicians of a professional standard that were really great.
Well, needless to say, what's been good for Howard Rumsey's place of business has been good for jazz on the West Coast in general. His accomplishments have reflected good on all jazz by the shores of the Pacific. Among them, his group was the first commissioned by a major university to compose and play jazz works. His men were the first to play and teach jazz at several Southern California high schools. His base of musical operations has been listed as a licensed gallery of modern art. Most recently, Howard's accomplishments include the establishment of his own company, Lighthouse Records, that's soon to offer up the first Lighthouse concert series, and here's the first album. But perhaps the most important thing is the fact that the All-Stars comprise the only modern jazz group anywhere that's been working at one place 52 weeks a year for almost 9 years. Any jazz musician will tell you that this is equal to a lifetime of security. It's apparent then why no list of jazz ambassadors can be complete without Rumsey's name.
The Lighthouse was just a stepping stone for the great players that came through there to go on and to fulfill their idea of working in the studios and making a nice living and becoming members of the Los Angeles local.
We played something called West Coast music. But the ironic part is that all the players, I think except Howard, were from New York or from the East Coast somewhere. So it was just a title they tagged onto us.
Not very many people know that I was a member of the Lighthouse All-Stars before they got famous. In the summer of '51, I worked down there on the Sunday afternoon sessions. And it was really a trip. The place was packed every Sunday with all these people right off the beach. They're dripping sand and sweat all over the place, and the band was up there playing hot. And see who was there? Shorty Rogers was there, Jimmy Jufrey. That was before a lot of guys left Kenton's band and went to work down there.
We had great customers that came in, all the actors, Lee Marvin, Marlon Brando, I mean, all the actresses, everybody. Liberace came in, he liked jazz, people like that. It was just a great place. We did an all-day concert on Sunday from 2 o'clock in the afternoon to 2 in the morning, right around the clock. And it was fun. It was just a fun place. And John Levine was a great owner. If you ever needed anything, he was there for you, whatever you needed, you know, money or whatever. Good guy. Just was a ball. Had a great time there. Was there 5 years. One of the last concerts that I played with the Lighthouse group was for Gene Norman. And he had several groups there, and we were featured, of course. And that was at Pasadena at the Civic Center out there. And the end of the show was a battle of the drummers. And it was Buddy Rich, Gene Krupa, Max Roach, and me, Stan Levey. I must tell you, Gene Krupa, Max Roach, and Stan Levey all sounded like babies in diapers after Buddy Rich got through with us. It was a wipeout. He was the most tremendous, tremendous player. He was surreal. He wasn't real. It's just inhuman, the things that he did. And we all just listened, and we couldn't do much about it, but we applauded him. When I was with Stan Kenton, I was back in 1952, 53, 54. It was a very loud band, as you know. A good band, but very loud. And the Zildjian Company sent me all the cymbals that I needed. They were very generous. We used 22s and 24s, big cymbals. Unfortunately, I used to break them. That's how loud I was playing in the band. And we just go through them like maybe 6 or 8 a year. It was really, really enormously loud band. And when I left the band, the Zildjian Company was very happy that I went into quieter work. In the days of the years that I played, we used very minimal equipment. Bass drum, snare drum, a tom-tom, maybe 2 tom-toms, a ride cymbal and a hi-hat, and maybe a small cut cymbal. Another company that sponsored me was the William F. Ludwig Company. And they would send me 2 or 3 sets a year. I had a 10 set contract with them. And they were very generous to me. Sticks, anything I needed. They just sent it right out to me on the road. And to me, they were the best drums. They had the best wood. The wood wasn't green. It was really mellowed and kiln dried. It was they got a very great sound. And I was very happy. I used Ludwig all through my career, and very happy that they did that for me. I worked with big bands and small bands. And the big bands are a little more difficult. You have to shepherd the ends of the band. In other words, you don't want to let things get away from you. You've got to keep everybody in line and moving forward with the beat. In the arrangements, you have open spots to fill, which you do, but you don't have the freedom that you have in a small band. In a small band, it's like flying because everybody has good time and you can be inventive and things just go right along with no problems.
You know, there are a lot of drummers, like for example, in big bands to me, Mel Lewis and Buddy Rich, with 2 different styles, are the 2 best big band drummers. Now, but I never would enjoy playing with them, either one of them, in a little band. It wasn't as much fun because Buddy Rich played Buddy Rich all the time, and Mel Lewis played Mel Lewis. Where once again, we talk about Stan again, Stan Levey played for you. I mean, he listened to you and once again gave you that time. That time was the most important thing.
The thing with Stan, he could play with a big band, small group, and, you know, I subbed for Stan with the Stan Kenton band for about 3.5 weeks, almost a month. He became ill and he went back to Philadelphia for some situation. I had subbed for him, And it's incredible. The man played just as well in 1948 than he did now.
There's an album called For Musicians Only, where he plays with Dizzy, Stan Getson, and I can't remember all the people. But that album is full of 45 minutes of fast tempos that forever. And Stan could do that. And Stan did that at the Lighthouse. And it was an object lesson for me just to watch his singular, his singular attitude about playing the drums. You could see it in his body, the way he played the drums. Erect, purposeful, one thing in mind. You could tell he was listening, but especially on those days when it was 2 to 2, 12 hours of music, he could sit up there and play that. He'd come off, ringing with sweat and everything, but it was a life lesson to me to see that kind of professionalism and how to play a job.
After 5 years at the Lighthouse, I felt that it's time to move on to other things. I was doing a lot of record dates anyway, and films and things like that. And I was starting to play the mallets. I was learning, I had a good teacher, Emil Richards, and other people like that, very good teachers. And I was getting into all the studio work. And the Lighthouse, I had been there 5 years. I felt it was enough, had to go on, move on. I was also starting my photography business. It was getting pretty heavy. And also about that time, I started to do the Tonight Show when they came out to the West Coast with Skitch Henderson, people like that. It would come out twice a year, 6 weeks each time. And they liked me, and I got the job on that. And I started to do album covers. In those days, they had the big albums, I'm still doing them, only they're CDs. In the early 60s, even though I was doing a lot of photography at that time, I was working with Nelson Riddle and things like that, and record dates and everything. And my good friend Max Bennett, bass player, very good bass player, said, Peggy Lee is looking for a drummer, and I have recommended you highly.
Peggy Lee, again, looking at a lady who transcended color, style, but totally different. Peggy Lee was a very beautiful and soulful lady. And as far as I'm concerned, she had this sultry voice. And the magic in her voice made her recordings.
I remember when we worked with Peggy Lee, I'll never forget that. We were at Basin Street East, and opening night was like amazing. Ray Charles was there that night, and Cary Grant introduced himself, and all these people were there. It was kind of scary, really, because the first time I had worked at Basin Street, and as the conductor and arranger, and we had this fantastic rhythm section with Max Bennett and Stan Levey, and Lou Levey, and Git Fiddle Lenny, Dennis Budimir. Was he bad, man? He was great.
They just released an album of the closing night of that group with Peggy, with a big band, Joe Harnell, at Basin Street East. And being that long ago, you forget how good it was, how good she was. And when you hear this thing, it's just, wow, instant recall, instant recall. She was really a great, great lady, and a great singer, and a great artist. She knew what she wanted. Again, she had that sound in her ear. It was all there, all built in.
Peggy was an amazing musician. I was fascinated how the ritual that she used to have before she'd go on stage. And she'd bring the rhythm section. Remember, we'd have all of us backstage, and we'd have to recite all the lyrics with her. And she had little sayings like sticks and bounds and kind of little rhymes and stuff she had every night. So we had to memorize the lyrics, so in case she forgot the lyrics, anybody in the rhythm section or the conductor could remind her of what the next lyrics were.
I always knew who Stan was, being a bebop fan, hanging out in New York near Birdland and the Royal Roost and NOLA rehearsal studios and so on to hear big bands. The first time I met him, when Jerry and I were in New York in the studio with Peggy Lee, and she did I'm a Woman. He was the drummer on the date.
I knew who he was from his reputation, and I saw him play, and I thought he was one of the badass drummers I'd ever seen. And he played on the Peggy Lee session, and one of the things he played, I'm a Woman was a killer. The minute I heard it, it was like, you know, I was hoping to get something that sounded like a Chess record, something like Muddy Waters. I didn't want a slick New York sound. And we got it. We got it. I don't remember how we got it. I don't know if we asked for it, but we got it. And then he did a side that never came out that both of us are committed to getting released, and that is a song that's almost as good as Shopping for Clothes, called the Slime.
Classic.
Cheek to cheek, toes to toes, here's a dance you can do on a dime. Knees to knees, nose to nose, hardly move, and you're doing the slime.
After Peggy, and I really enjoyed working with her, I was called by my good friend Norman Granz, and he wanted a new rhythm section for Ella Fitzgerald. That would be Paul Smith, wonderful, fantastic piano player, myself, and Wilfred Middlebrooks, very fine bass player. And we signed for a 2-year contract. The money was terrific, you know, of course. Norman went first class, and Ella was first class. What can I say about her singing? I mean, you just can't say anything about it. She's like an instrument. She's like Charlie Parker without a horn. Incredible sound, incredible interpretation of lyric, incredible phrasing, and a really, really nice girl. I mean, she was just great. She treated us beautifully.
Through Ray Brown, who was Ray's husband, Ella's husband at the time, I was able to work with Ella Fitzgerald. Now that was also a great learning experience. I learned how to accompany singers. She preferred the block chord style of accompanying, right, as opposed to the single line style of accompanying, which sometimes gets in the way of the performer. Actually, you're there to help, to support the solos, whether it be an instrumentalist or whether it be a vocalist, but you're there to support that person. So if you play too many contrary lines, different lines behind the solos, it's going to interfere with their line of train of thought. Whereas if you play block chords, it's like a band accompanying the singer or the solos. So she preferred that style. And I learned a lot about what not to do.
In the early 60s, I was doing a lot of studio work with people like Jack Marshall, Jack Sheldon, Joe Mondragon, people like that. We did a lot of television shows.
We did Run Buddy Run with Stan Levey and Jack Marshall and Frank Rosolino and Lou Levy, I think. All the Levy boys were there, and Joe Mondragon, and Howard Roberts too, I guess.
We would also go up to San Francisco and play in a place called the Trident. And we had a following up there, and we just had a wonderful time, good camaraderie. And a guy by the name of Sol Sachs, a writer, who wrote a lot of the shows that we did on television, would come with us, and just a wonderful weekend. Jack Marshall's son is Frank Marshall, who's one of the biggest producers in this town, which is LA, Kennedy Marshall, and still a good friend. And we were like the uncles to him. And I see him quite often now. I come to all the premieres. He's got a lot of Academy Award nominee pictures, and a very, very big success. After all the Vegas shows and working with those people and everything, I was back in town doing studio work. And I worked with Henry Mancini, who was a sweetheart of a guy and a great composer. Lalo Schifrin did a lot of movies with Steve McQueen.
I knew I had recordings of Stan already. I was a big fan of Hampton Hosts. And even in Argentina, I had recordings with Stan playing. And I knew that Stan had played with Charlie Parker too, and some recordings of Charlie Parker with Stan I had. And it's so important, the contribution that Stan made to the history of jazz. Needless to say, for me, it was like meeting another legend. And then, when I moved to California, of course, I thought, the first thing I thought about when I needed a drummer was Stan Levey. And one of my first movies was The Cincinnati Kid, where the end credit song, which became the song, the theme of the movie, was called The Cincinnati Kid and sung by Ray Charles, and he played on that recording. And then I started to do television. Like there was a show called THE Cat for NBC, and it was a series with Bob Loggia, and Stan played all the episodes.
I was blown away when I found out that Stan played on one of my favorite old pop rock records of all time, the Gene Pitney song, "Town Without Pity." It was Stan Levey on drums. Now I can't get over that. That blew me away.
I was very fortunate in the 50s and 60s to do albums under my own name. And they did very well. I have albums that are still selling today from 40 years ago. And VSOP is one of the companies, Bethlehem, Liberty. I did an album with Max Roach. We were co-leaders, called Drum and the Blues, and a couple with Dexter Gordon and Conte Candoli, all these guys. We really put out some good music. And the proof of that is that it still sells today. You can still order it, buy it in stores. And we did a quality product, not just because of me, but because of the writers and the players on those dates. They were really the best guys.
As a studio player, he played obviously with everyone. Name somebody and name a picture, name a television show, and he probably was there, playing drums, playing mallets, making the switch to mallets, which is not easy.
I think Henry Mancini and Johnny Mandel were the first to start introducing jazz into movies and television. So not too many people, not too many producers, not too many studios were keen in this kind of, but when they started to discover that there was a new sound, you know, then Stan played also my movie Bullet with Steve McQueen also. So everything I did in those days, Stan was my man, was my drummer.
The last thing that I did in music was Rosemary's Baby with Dick Hazard. And I just kind of lost interest, you know, and things were changing.
You know, the obvious differences in today and back then is that all the sessions were performance oriented, in that the musicians had to be, they were playing, first of all, in the room together, and they were, and nobody wanted to be the guy that made the mistake that had to stop the take and start all over again. So everybody was pretty much on their toes. And there was a nice little fear factor going on, I think. You know, the red light comes on and you just, you know, you might sweat a little bit under the armpits. You know, you're ready to perform. And that's different today. Today, there's no real, you know, need to worry about whether you've messed up or not, because everything can be fixed, everything can be edited. And that's kind of comforting in a way, but it takes away a certain amount of performance tension that I think is really important. That's a big part of difference in listening to records today as compared to records that were made back in the days when Stan was doing studio work.
When he decided to give up the drums, because the jazz scene was so tragic in this town and in the world at that time, and he didn't want to bastardize the instrument and play gigs and things like that. He'd had it. So what does he do? He takes up the percussion family, which timpani, mallets, you know, vibraphones, marimba, all that stuff, all those bells and whistles, and goes down in this house, I suppose, and stays there for I don't know how many months or years, and masters that, because he doesn't want to play the drums anymore.
Younger writers, younger producers, they wanted younger people in the studio, a younger look, and it just was time to move on. So I had my photography business going. It was going well, and I had to make a choice, and I did.
It's even more crazy to me to think that he would just give up an incredible playing career like that, and to just give it up, just to go into another business. I found that really intriguing. I didn't know how he could do that. But then somebody told me that It might have been the advent of the drum machines and all the technology and stuff that was on the horizon. And so that may have been actually a real timely decision, a well prophesied decision on his part to have quit right before everything changed.
I think it was in the 70s or something. He was doing what everybody used to dream of doing, which was sessions in Hollywood. And he got totally pissed off with them because they are boring, actually, but the impression they give is wonderful. You know, he did the movie. I think he was doing the soundtrack for sort of Rosemary's Baby or some really good, great movie. And he put the sticks down, so he told me. I think he was playing marimba or something, and he put the sticks down, and that was it. And he hasn't played the drums since.
I did many CD and album covers, designing and photographing, and it was a lot of fun doing that because I knew the guys, and it was easy for me to work with the musicians because they knew I was a player and a photographer, and we had a very, very good rapport.
Some of the albums that I have, I didn't know he'd taken the covers. He played and took the picture of that they used on the cover of a very famous musician called Victor Feldman, who, being English, of my generation, were extremely proud of Victor Feldman because him and Phil Seaman were like the most wonderful drummers. But Victor also played piano and vibraphone and moved to Hollywood, which was unheard of for an Englishman to do really, and make it. And Stan played on, along with the fantastic bass player called Scott LaFaro. He played on the first album that Victor was given, the trio. And he took the picture of on the cover with the three of them in a boat.
I've just been told that this chair I'm sitting in was the same chair that I sat in when Stan Levey, who gave up, as everybody knows, or maybe you don't, gave up drumming to become a photographer, took a picture for one of my album covers, was done in about 1962, which is, I'm sitting here, it's about 41 years ago, and I'm sitting in the same chair, except that I look different.
In the literary department, there are many books out on top icon musicians, really top men. I am very fortunate to be in those books as a part of them, with Dizzy, Charlie Parker's book, Miles Davis' book, Coleman Hawkins, etc., etc. And it's makes me feel very good to be included in those as a good friend and as a favored player. They use me as a player. They all like me. And it's just good to look back on that and read those books. Some of my favorite drummers are Max Roach, Philly Joe Jones, Roy Haynes, Don Lamont, Dave Tuff, Big Sid Catlett, people like that. These guys were really polished drummers. They knew how to work the drum set, and they had good ears. They listened to the music, and that's the main thing, listening to and absorbing the music and becoming a part of it. Shelly Manne was very good at that, a whole bunch of guys, and we miss them all.
It's surrealistic. You can't believe that the people that have inspired you all your life since you're that high, and then you use them, they're your role models and your idols and everything else, then you get to be to work with them, you become friendly with them, and you create with them, and it's like they can never go away. Basie was like that. Basie, I met Basie when I was 13 years old, and Clark Terry, who taught me how to put my trumpet to my mouth, you know. Time is no joke. It's an amazing phenomenon.
Duke Ellington said it's only two kinds of music, good or bad. And bebop was good music. It was new music, and it was being brought by people that I don't think they were well known at the time, but they were sensational.
Ever since I've ever heard music, I thought it should be very clean, very precise, as clean as possible anyway, you know, and more or less to the people, you know, something they could understand, something that was beautiful, you know. Because definitely there's stories and stories and stories that can be told in the musical idiom, you know. You wouldn't say idiom either. It's so hard to describe music other than the basic way to describe it. Music is basically melody, harmony, and rhythm. But I mean, people can do much more with music than that. It can be very descriptive in all kinds of ways, you know, all walks of life.
I guess we all have a tendency to take it for granted that all the people, all of you, while we're all walking around on this earth together, you take the existence for granted. And then when they're no longer here, one great thing about music is that the chemical energy goes away, but the sound and the soul and the spirit holds on forever. And we were fortunate, I think very, very fortunate, that the time that we happened to be born and came up, even 10 years either way, we were some of the luckiest people alive because we got a chance to not only participate in some of the best music that was ever made, but also to hear some of the best music ever made. And we would take it for granted when all these giants are around, the Byrds and Lesters and Basie and Ella and Sarah and Duke and Dizzy and everybody. It's Miles. It's astounding, you know, when you look back and you see the whole, have a focus on the whole eras. It's just awesome. But I wouldn't trade this time that we came up than any other time, because that's when it was happening. Songwriters, musicians, and everything else, and the bands, that's what was happening.
The kind of drumming that Stan did, that Max did, was drumming in which drummers listened to what the other players were doing, in which they were musicians, they were not soloists, at least not all the time. Drummers today tend to, and I hate to generalize about this, but there's a tendency among many young drummers to not really listen to what other players are doing, to not take the responsibility for filling out the textures, for supporting the solo, for energizing the swing, to hear the sensitivity to hear what a soloist is doing and stay with him as he's going on a kind of a course and his momentum is being established and the drummer takes it along. That's very subtle stuff. And it takes musicality, it takes intelligence, and it takes a certain kind of self-effacing quality that certainly was true with Stan, with Max Roach, with all of the drummers from that era.
When I talk about people like Stan Levey and Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie, you know, I wax eloquent because these were elegant people, and you know, it's just a pleasure just to remember the great experiences I had working with these guys.
To be in that studio when he cut the record with Dizzy and Stan Getz must have been unbelievable spark. But live, you know, if you were Norman Grant standing there saying push the button now, and you were just standing there watching them play, it must have been unbelievably fantastic.
It still kind of blows my mind that the guy that played the way he played on so many great jazz records with so many great jazz artists, and across the spectrum, I mean, from Dizzy Gillespie up to Lalo Schifrin in the studios, and you know, and all the stuff in between, Peggy Lee, all the great things he did, just to hang it up, you know, just to say, okay, I'm done now. That was pretty amazing to me.
I have to admire his convictions and his integrity, because when in the studios the music started to change from jazz to rock and roll, and later on to all the different styles that, you know, they come from the blues, yeah, but they were different. Then Stan had the integrity to say, no, I'm not going to play that music. And in that sense, I admire him, because it takes a lot of courage to do such a thing. The studios it's almost like a Faustian pact. You sell your soul to the devil, and he did not. And for that, I applaud him, and I keep him in my memories and in my heart forever. As long as I live, he's going to be part of my life.
Thank you for joining Stan Levey in this look back in time about his life in music and photography. It was a great time in musical history, and there are very few players left from that era. But Stan is still here. We enjoyed having you with us. Thank you very much.